My name is Gabe Rotman and I am an ASPI Council member, and I'm delighted to welcome you all, both those who are watching us virtually and those here in the room tonight, to this evening's event on Women, Peace and Security, Reflections on Afghanistan. Following the evacuation of international forces and the ceasing of diplomatic presence, the human rights and security of women in Afghanistan is now more uncertain than ever. That means it is now more important than ever that like-minded partners focus their efforts on assisting women and girls and upholding the women, peace and security agenda in Afghanistan. Now, tonight's event will feature a keynote presentation from Senator the Honourable Marise Payne, Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women, and also a very special presentation, a virtual presentation from Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Anniken Huitfeldt. Now, this will be followed by a discussion with our experienced panel and an opportunity for questions and answers. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting and on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and to the traditional owners of the lands from which you are all viewing. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, and in particular First Nations women, whose unique experiences and perspectives must inform the broader discussions of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I'd also like to highlight the role of the Embassies of Norway, of Netherlands and Croatia in their capacities as NATO contact point embassies, and of Norway as a member of the United Nations Security Council in prioritising their efforts to uphold the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Afghanistan. Now I'd like to invite the ambassadors to provide some brief opening remarks. First up, Your Excellency, Mr. Paul Gulleik Larsen, Ambassador of Norway to Australia. May I please invite you to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail, and thanks first of all to all of you at ASPI for co-hosting this really milestone event. This is part of our embassy's efforts to strengthen relations with Australia, which are deeper and more strategic than ever before. And welcome to NATO partners and participants from Australia to Afghanistan, Georgia and Ukraine. Of course, our thoughts today are with the Ukrainian people standing up to Russian aggression. And I can assure you on behalf of all of us co-hosts that we are doing whatever we can short of military action to support Ukraine with defensive weapons, humanitarian assistance, diplomacy and sanctions to try to stop the war, working with partners in Europe, NATO, and the United Nations. Inside the Security Council, Ambassador Mona Juul and her Norwegian team is cooperating with allies to counter Russian actions, including by uniting for peace in the General Assembly last week. And I want to thank in particular Fiji and the Pacific states for being key to securing such a large majority for the resolution demanding an end to Russia's attacks. At the same time, of course, the Council also continues to deal with other threats to peace and security in Africa, Indo-Pacific, Myanmar, North Korea, and of course, Afghanistan. Norway, as chair of the Sanctions Committee and the pen holder, together with Estonia on the UNAMA mission, remains deeply engaged with Afghanistan with humanitarian and diplomatic efforts, even if our troops pulled out last year. Protection and participation of women and girls in Afghanistan and elsewhere is a top priority for Norway's membership of the Council this year and a main motive for hosting this seminar. We are honored to have eminent panelists as well as two foreign ministers, Senator the Honourable Marise Payne, followed by our own Anniken Huitfeldt by video from Oslo, to speak on this topic, which is so crucial to peace and security, but also to respect for human rights and international law. Finally, I just want to convey greetings from our colleague, the Ambassador of Afghanistan, Wahid, who is in Melbourne today with his community, but pass all his greetings to everyone who still care about the Afghan people, as he said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Can I now please invite Her Excellency, Mrs. Marion Derckx, Ambassador of Netherlands, to address us. Thank you.
Well, building on what my friend Paul, the Ambassador of Norway, just said, a few more reflections. When we took on the initiative to this event, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan was fresh on our minds. And meanwhile, the war in Ukraine has broken out, an entirely different war. A war that requires all the support we can give to the people of Ukraine, who are suffering so much in this unjust war. Support together with our international partners, including Australia, the countries defending the international rules-based order. We took this initiative with 3 NATO member states, and also having Australia in mind as an important partner of NATO in the field of as an enhanced opportunities partner and as one of the 4 Asia-Pacific partners to NATO. As you know, NATO is a military political organization established after the Second World War to secure peace and security in the North Atlantic region. Despite the military centrality, NATO is very well aware that security is a much broader concept than only military. It's also about human security, about absence of terrorism, economic security, issues resulting from climate change, and so on. The war in Ukraine requires our full attention. At the same time, we cannot forget about other conflict zones and human suffering like in Afghanistan. War is not over when a peace deal is signed, let alone when a new regime has imposed itself, like in Afghanistan's case. We are obliged to stay involved in Afghanistan if we are serious about our intentions to increase security, if we are serious about improving the position of women and girls, and if we are serious about our values as laid down in the UN Charter. We have the obligation to reflect on what we can continue to do and how we can act. How, also now that the Taliban took over, we can support the women and girls in Afghanistan. How can we maintain as much as possible the increased level of security for women and girls in Afghanistan that had been achieved over the past years? So with my Norwegian and Croatian colleague, I'm looking forward to a fruitful exchange of ideas of all the honored guests to this event here tonight. Thank you.
Can I now please invite Her Excellency Ms. Betty Pavelich, Ambassador of Croatia, to address us. Thank you very much, Excellency.
Thank you very much. Ministers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's an honor to be with you here at ASPI in my capacity as co-contact point embassy for Australia with the Netherlands, and to engage in this discussion on, well, the day after International Women's Day. I'm particularly pleased to be joined by 2 very dear friends with whom I had the privilege of working in my previous capacity as the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Republic of Croatia to NATO. Ambassadors and panelists and Ambassador Mari Skara from Norway and Brigadier General Gordana Garasic. Let me just start by saying that having women at the decision-making table really does make a difference. At the NATO summit in Chicago in May 2012, Ambassador Skara and I, along with 6 other women deputy permanent representatives, worked on negotiating the Alliance's summit communique, in which we reiterated NATO's commitment to the full implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. We also succeeded in negotiating what would become the start of fundamental change in the way NATO worked to address gender-based violence in conflict, the lack of effective institutional arrangements to protect women, and the continued underrepresentation of women in peace processes. The process of mainstreaming UNSCR 1325 into NATO's work, as well as its operations and missions, was launched. NATO welcomed Norway's offer at the time to provide a NATO special representative for women, peace, and security, my dear friend Mari, who you will hear from in a minute. And all of NATO's policies from then on had to be assessed through a gender lens. This helped us recognize the need to change things like the rules of engagement for our military on the ground so that they could actually provide practical assistance to Afghan women in need. Female engagement teams, such as the ones deployed by Australia during the ISAF and Resolute support missions to engage directly with Afghan women, were also created. And with Mari's leadership, we were able to secure the appointment of the first female flag officer, Brigadier General Gulleik, Croatia's first female general, as the gender advisor to the commander of ISAF in Afghanistan. We were encouraged by some of the progress that was being made, especially when it came to assisting Afghan women. However, we are deeply, deeply saddened by the current circumstances in Afghanistan, as well as in Ukraine, and particularly with respect to the plight of women and children. We must all continue to lend our voices and support to protect those women remaining in Afghanistan and those who have sought shelter outside of its borders. We must continue to work together to address the serious impediments to peace without women, not just in Afghanistan, but elsewhere in the world at the table. And I stand ready to do my part. And on a final note, I'd just like to congratulate Norway for all of your leadership in this UNSC 1325 agenda, and to congratulate you on the announcement yesterday of the appointment of another dear friend and colleague, Anita Nergard, as the new permanent representative of Norway to NATO. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to ASPI for working on this initiative with us. As the representative of a country that itself lived through war, that lived through a major refugee crisis, that lived through displacement, that lived through sexual violence and conflict, we are particularly concerned with what is happening in Ukraine. We remain concerned with the plight of women in Afghanistan, and we as a nation will continue to do our part. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for that very heartfelt call to action. It was a wonderful speech. Thank you. We're now crossing, I understand, to the Minister. Welcome, Minister. Can I please welcome Senator the Honourable Maurice Payne, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Minister for Women, to deliver tonight's keynote address. Thank you, Minister. All good?
Thank you. Thank you, Gay. And
okay.
hope the technology is working. I appreciate your patience at that end, and good evening, everyone. May I thank ASPI board member Gay Brotman, our ASPI moderator today, Anastasia Kapetis, your Excellencies, including Australia's Ambassador for Women and Girls, Christine Clark, and the very many distinguished guests who are there, both physically and online this afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to offer my reflections on Afghanistan and on women, peace and security to mark International Women's Day 2022. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the many lands given the nature of a virtual event, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We know that this event and its planning, its topic, have been ongoing since last year, months before the current crisis caused by the most recent actions of Russia. And back then, who would have thought that it was possible that the beginning of 2022 would present more challenges, be more difficult in many ways than 2021, but so it has become. Never has it been more important for us to focus on NATO and on the women, peace and security agenda, not just as it relates to Afghanistan, which is vitally important in and of itself, but as a universal good that must underpin our approach to global collective security and become part of the DNA of our shared values and principles. I thank their Excellencies, the Ambassadors of Croatia, the Netherlands and Norway for framing this event today. Thank you, Betty, Marion and Paul. They and all NATO nation ambassadors in Australia have been exceptionally important to our country over the last 20 years. As an enhanced opportunities partner with NATO, Australia takes our NATO partnership very seriously indeed. I met again with Secretary-General Stoltenberg in Munich a fortnight ago, and I have much appreciated our engagement over many years now in my roles both as Australia's Minister for Defence and Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs. At every stage, it has been clear to me that NATO is a central delivery platform for the women, peace and security agenda. To the members of the Afghan Australian community who are here today, welcome. I assure you that while the egregious Russian invasion of Ukraine is dominating international focus, our attention continues on the continuing crisis in Afghanistan. And that's why I'm very pleased to participate in this discussion today. Indeed, both crises demonstrate some fundamental similarities. A failure to negotiate in good faith by one of the parties. The attempt by one party to subjugate the people's right to legitimate self-determination, and one party using violence to obtain territorial gain. Before I do turn to Afghanistan, it is important to mark the power of international pressure on Russia. For Australia's part, we join with many other nations and with NATO in unreservedly condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine and in calling for a halt to hostilities and the withdrawal of Russian forces. We're joining other nations in effective financial and trade sanctions against Russia, in voicing our strongest opposition to Russia's egregious violation of Ukraine's legitimate sovereignty, and in providing an initial $35 million of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. And Australia is also providing assistance in the form of military equipment. The unity of action in the international community over Russia shows the power of coordinated international action that can also be applied to Afghanistan. The dynamics are different, and the situation is perhaps even more complex with Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we're trying to financially assist a severe humanitarian crisis while keeping money out of the hands of Taliban, corruption, and of terrorist networks. Nevertheless, we have seen pressure on the Taliban work. The Taliban administration is not recognised. It doesn't control embassies around the world. It can't generate a diplomatic corps. We're not allowing its rhetoric against women and girls to gain credence. We're challenging Taliban human rights abuses, and we're maintaining pressure on the Taliban to renounce violence, to cease retributions, and to honour the undertakings it has made to the international community. On Monday of this week, Australia and Spain delivered a joint statement in the UN Human Rights Council during the interactive dialogue on Afghanistan. On behalf of 60 co-signatory nations, we made 5 fundamental points. We assert that without women's full, equal and meaningful participation in civic and economic life, women do not have the opportunity to freely express and represent their own interests, enjoy the security of generating livelihoods, or contribute to the stability and prosperity of Afghanistan. Secondly, we are deeply concerned that women have been systematically excluded from public life in Afghanistan, with reports of job losses, restrictions on human rights and fundamental freedoms, including through arbitrary detentions, restrictions on political participation, and lack of access to essential services. Thirdly, we support the right to freedom of opinion and expression exercised by peaceful demonstrators during recent women's rights protests in Afghanistan. Fourthly, we insist on the removal of gender-specific restrictions which currently amplify the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, easing the humanitarian crisis that women have the agency to partake equally in all aspects of the response, and that girls are free to continue their education as the schooling year begins this month. And we assert, finally, that women's empowerment and girls' education benefits all Afghans without distinction. Colleagues, for Afghanistan, I believe firmly that the Women, Peace and Security agenda can be one of our most effective tools. WPS has long been a key element of our approach to security discussions and funding approaches, be it in conflict, in humanitarian aid, in development assistance or disaster relief programs. The heart of WPS lies both the fact and the fundamental truth that peace, stability, security and conflict recovery is measurably more effective when women are active participants in negotiations and agreements than when they are not. With Afghanistan's dual imperatives of recovering from conflict and surviving a humanitarian crisis, there's no plausible, no legitimate excuse for the isolation and disempowerment of women on any grounds, religious or otherwise. After the Taliban was removed from power in Afghanistan in 2002, life for all sectors of the community improved, especially for women and girls. School enrolments increased tenfold from 2002. Access to healthcare rose from 9% to 57% between 2002 and 2020. The maternal mortality rate fell from 1,100 deaths to 396 deaths per 100,000 live births between 2000 and 2015. Still far too high, but a remarkable shrinking in those numbers. Women's representation in politics increased from 0 in 2001 to 27% in 2020. With the support of the then Afghan government, the Australian government funded programs that led to an improvement in the economic well-being of 20,000 women and girls living in rural areas in Afghanistan through reforms in agriculture and by supporting a successful women-only marketplace to sell their products in a secure environment. We supported the education of over 50,000 students, 80% of whom were girls, and mostly in remote regions. As a donor to the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, we helped to leverage around US $17.5 million through community groups and World Bank grants to distribute to Afghans, 80% of whom were women, in the form of catalytic entrepreneurial loans. Women and girls' economic participation, access to health and education, and their protection and security have been a core focus for Australia's diplomatic, defence and international development engagement since we began our assistance to Afghanistan. Since 2005, Australia provided over $1.5 billion in development and humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan to assist in driving these vital changes. We're continuing our long-standing commitments. In September last year, I announced a further $100 million for humanitarian assistance to respond to the crisis in Afghanistan, with a specific focus on supporting women and girls. I've seen the benefits of the work of ADF gender advisors on the ground in Afghanistan. I've heard the heartfelt views of women in Afghanistan and the heartfelt views of the gender advisors delivering that support, and seen how important that engagement has been historically. Not just Australian gender advisors, but many others. I'm immensely proud of the work that Australia has done with the international community through those gender advisors over many years, and I heard Betty refer to others. Very immensely proud of that work. Particularly when I saw Australian women in uniform delivering that support, and very much hope that we can find a pathway through to ensuring that such support can be delivered again. What we see in Afghanistan, and also unfortunately in Ukraine, shows that we do need clear thinking. We need strategies and we need national action plans to address the UN's Women, Peace and Security agenda. These strategies and these NAPs demonstrate we're prepared to own the challenge ourselves, not leave it all to the UN to achieve alone. Last year, my government released the second Australian National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. We renewed our commitment to the full and equal participation of women and girls in peace and security arrangements. The Australian National Action Plan identifies 4 goals: meaningful female participation in peace processes around the world, fighting sexual and gender-based violence, building national resilience to meet the needs of women and girls, and showing leadership on women, peace and security. We look at all of these aspects when considering how best to deploy humanitarian and development assistance and other conflict resolution or restorative justice programs. My government is also working with the international community and civil society organisations to press for the maintenance of rights for women and girls in Afghanistan and for their security and other needs. Just a fortnight ago, although it seems longer, I co-hosted with Germany's new Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, a meeting of the female foreign ministers who were attending the Munich Security Conference. We spoke then of the importance of women's leadership and human security and how to advance our goals. On Monday night this week, I chaired a virtual meeting of female foreign ministers called to discuss the situation faced by women in Afghanistan. With 18 female foreign ministers attending, it was the largest grouping to meet to date. It shows that more women are holding the role of foreign minister, and that's a good thing. And it shows that we are working together on the WPS agenda, and that is a very good thing. We listened on Monday evening, very late here and across the world at other time zones, to 3 Afghan women speak so powerfully about their experiences and about their views on what needs to happen next in Afghanistan. One of the participants was the former Afghan Minister for Women, Hasina Safi, who has had to leave Afghanistan. During my last visit to Kabul in May last year, it was my honour to meet Hasina Safi, and to discuss the advances for women and girls in Afghanistan and the challenges. And it remains my honour to continue working with her on these vital issues, to try to halt the erosion of social and economic gains made over the last 20 years. With many other nations, Australia remains committed to the cause of women and girls in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and around the world. Afghan women have demonstrated they are active and tireless agents of change. They're crucial in shaping the future of their country. The international community will stand by its ongoing commitments to support Afghan women to participate fully, equally, and meaningfully at all levels of security and other decision-making. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown us, global peace and security can never be taken for granted as a normal state of the world. Threats can emerge quickly and dramatically. We won't allow a new crisis to displace the unfinished objectives of a previous crisis, and will continue to press forward on the women, peace and security agenda at every stage of our international dealings, for Afghanistan, for Ukraine, and for elsewhere in the world. I thank ASPI very much for today's initiative and for the honour and opportunity to make these remarks. Thank you.
We're right to go. Okay. It's now my great pleasure to introduce a virtual presentation
Your
from
Excellency.
Norway's-
Your Excellency.
And let me introduce you, sister. It's now my great pleasure to introduce a virtual presentation from Norway's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ms. Anniken Huitfeldt. We'll cross to her right now. Your Excellency, look forward to hearing from you. Oh, your Minister, sorry. Look forward to hearing from you.
This past week has reminded us that we cannot take peace for granted. Today there is a war in Europe. Ukrainian women are mobilizing as a part of the resistance. Others have fled. However, there are few women involved at decision-making tables. Women's participation is crucial. As a NATO member, Norway puts women's voices in front and in the center. When women participate, conflict resolution is less likely to fail. To the women themselves, participation comes at a price. They experience threats and reprisals for speaking out. This is a trend we see in too many conflicts. We see it in Afghanistan. We see it in Yemen, Sudan, Mali and Myanmar. It is important that authorities protect women's right to participate fully, equally, and meaningfully in decision making in civil society and in all aspects and phases of peace and security processes. Since 2007, we have asked the Taliban to include women and protect women's rights. Afghanistan is a clear example of women being targeted, marginalized, and excluded. Afghan women who raise their voices in protest are often silenced. We condemned the harassment and arrests of women human rights defenders. Since the Taliban came to power, it has taken less than 7 months to put the rights of Afghan women in jeopardy. Rights which were hard fought. Rights which came at a price. Rights we must continue to fight for. We will continue to support arenas for dialogue between women and other members of civil society and the Taliban. The security and rights for women who engage in dialogue and who speak out must be protected in Afghanistan and elsewhere. We believe participation ensures the best protection for women and women's rights. Threats and attacks targeting women in peace processes are unacceptable. When such attacks do occur, we must respond resolutely and in ways designed by women themselves. Excellencies, I believe participation is a long-term game changer. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to thank specifically all of our previous speakers and the two ministers we've just heard from what I think are pretty inspiring and heartfelt remarks, so thank you. My name's Anastasia Kapetis. I'm the National Security Editor here at ASPI, and it's my privilege tonight to welcome a really distinguished panel to discuss the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Afghanistan going forward. First of all, I'd like to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Marion. She is currently serving as Norway's ambassador to Dublin. She was Norway's ambassador to Afghanistan from 2016 to 2018, and previously was the first NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, and that was from 2010 to 2012. Welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Brigadier General Gordana Grasic. She is currently serving as the Head of Planning Directorate of the Croatian Armed Forces General Staff. She served 2 mandates in NATO-led operations, in ISAF operations in Afghanistan between 2010 and 2014. During her last tour, she held the position of Gender Advisor to ISAF Commander. Next, I'd like to introduce Her Excellency Ms. Cecilia Wiegers, the Ambassador of the Netherlands to Afghanistan, where she focuses on rule of law and security sector related themes. Also like to welcome to the stage in person Ambassador Christine Clark. She is Australia's Ambassador for Women and Girls. Ambassador Clark worked with the Pacific Gender Section in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on reserve service following completion of her very lengthy full-time naval career. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Farkande Akbari. She is the postdoctoral research fellow at Monash Gender Peace and Security Centre. Her research focuses on diplomatic actors and peace settlement negotiations with non-state armed groups. And I'd just like to remind the audience here and also online that you can think about some questions, and if you're online, please post them up and we will try and get to you in the Q&A section. So first of all, I'd like to ask the panel, the UN mandate, the Special Assistance Mission mandate for Afghanistan is due for renewal on the 17th of March. What's the significance of the renewal of that mandate for the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Afghanistan going forward? Perhaps, Ambassador Skade, we could start with you. Oh, apologies, Ambassador, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was in control of it myself. There you go. So, but good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this event, and I'm very honored to be in this very distinguished panel. It is lovely for me to meet old friends and colleagues again. And I feel truly as a part of our global community being able to participate in a debate like this, the very timely debate like this. And if I can just to start to say that I had wished yesterday that I could wish everybody a happy International Women's Day, which I couldn't. In light of the aggression of Russia and the war against Ukraine, in light of the ongoing conflicts and the harsh oppression of women around the world, I did not feel it was a happy day. So I feel a bit sad and it's also taking part in this discussion. The UN mission in Afghanistan had a very, very critical role, of course, throughout the past decade. And the mandate it will expire on the 17th of March, and ongoing negotiations are challenging. As you understand, all members of the UN Security Council have to agree to this mandate. And Norway is the facilitator or the pen holder. So we are in charge of the negotiations and will, of course, seek consensus. But we, as a starting point, do feel it's extremely important that UNAMA gets a strong mandate from the UN, that it's enabled to promote a political dialogue, that it's enabled to monitor and report on the human rights situation in Afghanistan, and that it's enabled to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So we will see where the negotiations leads us, but we really, really want a mandate that enables UNAMA to keep a key focus on women's participation and women's rights in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can I just ask any other members of the panel, do you have anything to add about the significance of the renewal of that mandate, and perhaps some of even the difficulties facing getting a a mandate that works for women and girls in Afghanistan? Yes. Sorry, is that Brigadier Gorasi? No, sorry.
It's Cecilia Weigers here, Ambassador for the Netherlands to Afghanistan.
Apologies.
Good morning to you all, dear colleagues of ASPI, Excellency, and colleagues. I'm speaking to you from Doha. And in Doha, we have the informal contact group that unites a big group of ambassadors dedicated to Afghanistan. And of course, the mandate has been a subject of discussion over the last weeks, months, and now days. It is a unique situation as the UN tries to get this mandate approved in a unique context with a regime that nobody recognizes, in time of sanctions, with a population that is in a heavy crisis, and also, of course, with a very challenging environment now in the Security Council. So this is where we try to help, to also collect arguments why this strong mandate is necessary. And especially, of course, on the political rights and also the human rights. These things are very important that we maintain it. But also, we should not underestimate the effects of the economy, the crisis, and the humanitarian crisis. So all that, it's a bit much for UNAMA. And of course, it is part of this whole UN effort in order to support the Afghan population in the coming years. So we try our best also from here, but it is a discussion, of course, that is mostly New York based, and we're looking with a lot of attention what is happening there. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can I perhaps just ask, what happens if the mandate is not achieved?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer this. Perhaps our Norwegian colleague can say more about this.
I think that's very difficult to predict actually what will actually happen. And therefore it's really important that we do achieve consensus. The challenges is they are so immense in Afghanistan right now when it comes to women's situation and rights. And if I can just say that when I worked in Afghanistan and with Afghanistan, we did see progress on women's rights, but the gains were very fragile and certainly not irreversible. So we need the UN on the ground in Afghanistan to monitor and report on their situation. We need the UN to communicate on what's going on, and already we are receiving extremely concerning reports on arbitrary killings, kidnappings, disappearance, and so on. So it's just essential that we have the UN on the ground in Afghanistan, and the UN is the only international organization that can take on a role. It's going to be very challenging for the UN to fulfill a strong mandate, but it's the only option that we have.
Thank you. Do any of the panel members have any further comments on that question? All right, we'll move. Yes, please, Brigadier.
Hello, everyone. If I just can start thanking actually to two remarkable women, Her Excellencies, who set me on the path of the most challenging and the best experience I ever had. Ambassador Pavelich and Skare, thank you. As a military, I can only add to this discussion concerning the UNAMA that UNAMA will be only boots on the ground, as we would say in military language. And as Ambassador Skare said, it's very important to have somebody there now on the ground to report what's happening, because gains that we definitely achieved through NATO advisors and gender advisors and integration of gender perspective, a little bit later I will introduce that. I think they are not completely sustainable and they are not irreversible, as we heard, but we have to support them somehow. So having people on the ground, international community who can do something about it, or at least give us a true report what's going on, so international community can do something about it. This is really important at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we just move to women on the ground in Afghanistan and in the Afghan diaspora? What are women in Afghanistan and in those communities asking for in terms of international action, both at the multilateral level, but also in terms of civil society response?
Can I take on this one? I guess that's a yes. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak at this very special event and alongside with very distinguished panelists. But I think in the last 6 months, we have heard Afghan women from across the country that what they want, and they have talked about it. They have given interviews about it at the cost of their lives, and it is really very simple and boiled down to 3 things that it has been held on the posters of these girls walking across the streets protesting while the Taliban had their AK-47s pointed at their chest, that they want food, they want work, they want freedom. And it's really the WPS agenda in Afghanistan right now. I mean, what we need to focus and everything else aside, that this is what the women of Afghanistan want. And this is asked by across the country. It's regardless of ethnic background, religious sect, or urban and rural divide. They all want that. And I've been hearing from other distinguished speakers, and as an Afghan myself, very, very grateful that there is such a strong support and solidarity with these women. But what I want to really clarify that and mention that the clarity and the consensus internationally and the message sending for the support is really, really critical for Afghan women and what is being asked in those very fundamental rights that has been taken away from them. And another point is that the gains of the last 20 years, yes, unfortunately, the way in which the Taliban came to power and then the peace talk did not yield into any meaningful result, and the military takeover meant the Taliban unfortunately had to, or did, as we watch, re-establishing their gender apartheid regime, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. But watching everything else, those rules, and I mean the equality and in the constitution, protection of women's rights in Afghanistan with the support of the international community, have been sort of felt that it's wiped. But I want to assure you that there are women across the country that are still there, and they're not lost. And here, I mean, their fate is at stake. They still want to fight. They're powerful. They're resilient to continue. And here we just need to mobilize ourselves internationally to be able to provide the support they needed. And in Afghan diasporas, and unfortunately many of the civil society organizations had to evacuate. In a way, we sort of lost our eyes and ears on the ground, more formally, but informally a lot still exists. And if you want to connect any moment with anyone across Afghanistan, you could find them, and these women have been very, very vocal. And it's just that the approach needs to be very simplified and going to the grassroots level, and by that I mean connecting directly. 20 years was a good opportunity for international community to connect not only on the top level, on the elite level, but with the people of Afghanistan. And they're not lost. They're still there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Akbari. Ambassador Sky. Oh, sorry. Ambassador Wheaton. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. Just to support what Farkande just said, is that what we see is that also a new generation has stood up, meanwhile, of young women who are very courageous. And we all have seen that came also at the expense of their own security, with the latest cases of abductions of women who disappeared for a couple of weeks even, despite requests from all of us to have more information about their whereabouts and whether they were safe or not. So this do no harm principle is important for us as partners to the Afghan population and donor countries, is that, yes, we are here to support the cause of women and girls, but we should think twice of how we are going to do this. And what I've seen also is that Afghan women want to be heard. That's the freedom that Farkande also talked about. But they also want to be heard by their own people, by the leaders of the de facto regime. And for that also, I would like really to comment what happened in Norway, where the ASREP meeting, and in the margin of that, a civil society delegation met with representatives of the de facto regime. It's kind of strange that this happened outside Afghanistan, and this is what we also stress in our engaging contact with the de facto regime, is that we expect that these kinds of exchanges also can happen in Afghanistan itself. So this is something that requires diplomacy to also convince that the civic space that women need in order to be heard, that this is not something threatening, but something that will contribute to a more steady society and to more input in this common internal legitimacy. So I stop there. I can say a lot of words about this, but tell me if I can add more later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. Ambassador Scalo.
Thank you very much. And if I can just join forces here to amplify the messages from civil society and how important they are. They were also always extremely important to me as NATO Special Representative and my work in Afghanistan. I enjoyed very much the strong partnership with strong civil society leaders that forced the agenda in Afghanistan. And I'm very sad to see that so many of my previous partners are on the run and under such oppression right now. So I do feel that the international community has an obligation, of course, to report and monitor, as we spoke about. We have an obligation to provide a lectern, a microphone, a seat at the table of Afghan women. We have an obligation to amplify and support the messages. But we also have an obligation to try to forge a dialogue, a direct dialogue between the de facto authorities, the Taliban in Afghanistan, and civil society representatives. And this was very much in the forefront of our thinking when we arranged a meeting with the Taliban and the representatives of the international community and representatives of Afghan civil society. It provided a safe space to have a direct dialogue on critical issues. Of course, such a meeting will not change everything, but we do need to enable a dialogue, a platform for a dialogue with the de facto authorities in order to keep them accountable. They have the responsibility for the safety and the well-being of the people of Afghanistan. We as an international community must keep the pressure on them.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Clark.
So, I mean, I had the great joy of meeting Dr. Akbari last night in Melbourne, and we're not working? No? Yes, well, I've got a thumbs up from down the back. It was wonderful to meet Dr. Akbari and Ambassador Wasi last night in Melbourne and the diaspora. And we stand by and ready to amplify the voices of diverse Afghan women to ensure that their concerns and priorities are heard and addressed. There were many passionate voices in the room last night, as there were many passionate voices. The three women, the very brave three women that spoke to the female foreign ministers on Monday evening. We must amplify their voices. We are deeply concerned by the rapid shift to all normalizing the discriminatory gender norms and the general curtailment of women and girls' fundamental rights and freedoms. Women's participation in the media has been significantly restricted, so how do we hear from them? And women's peaceful protests have been met, as we've heard, in some cases with violence and arbitrary detention and even deaths. Women have been banned from appearing on television and from the public service, except in health and education. We need them at the table, the decision-making tables. We continue to promote Afghan women as agents of change and encourage their critical role in peace, security, and stability decision-making. And we will provide international platforms with all of our partners here. We will provide those international platforms for Afghan women to advocate for themselves and for their communities. We recognise Afghan women as equal partners to inform policy priorities and decision-making. And we will amplify advocacy opportunities that are driven by Afghan women. And there are many of the diaspora who are willing to step into that space. We need to support them in amplifying their voices.
Thanks, Ambassador. Do any other panel members have any comments to add here? Well, what I might ask you all next is, there's such a cost for women in Afghanistan and in the diaspora, in the diasporas, of speaking out. How can, in practical terms, the international community help those women be safer as they do that?
Perhaps I can make a start on this one. I think the truth is we are very handicapped in trying to protect them from a distance. Since the evacuation last year in August, most of us of the Western embassies are not present anymore in Kabul, but we still have also regional embassies, so countries from the region who are represented. This is an important factor in this whole discussion. Where it comes to the argumentation why women should not be seen anymore in public life, why they would not be able to participate, often Islam is being quoted, or cultural norms are being cited. And we as Western partners have a hard time countering these kinds of arguments. But more moderate Islamic countries, they can. And what we see in practice that they do that as well, is that when it comes to, for instance, access to education, we see a change of tone in the conversations that we have with Taliban. In the beginning, it was kind of difficult, and we had the feeling it was a Western ask or some kind of condition, benchmark, whatever you want to call it. But meanwhile, they have embraced it and are not citing anymore Islam as a reason why women would not have equal access to education. They refer sometimes to culture or to local hindrances. So we see a slight change of language. When it comes to physical security, I think we have to really rely on the estimation of the women themselves. What you often see with human rights defenders is that others think it's not safe for them, and therefore certain things are not being done. I think that the women in Afghanistan are very well capable of deciding which risk they would like to take. But it is true at this moment, it's very fickle. We don't know what the results would be if women go on the streets again. And it's clear that after the episodes concerning those 4 women protesters, their abductions, is that we haven't seen any protests on the street. So this is, this is just a very negative development. So the big question is, we know that Taliban is familiar with demonstrations, so they know that people should be able to go on the streets. It's just that those who are against them are not allowed really to voice their concerns in public. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Skare.
Thank you very much. I would just like to emphasize also that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is enormous. So it's critical for the international community to be enabled to provide humanitarian assistance. And of course, to do that, we have to have a dialogue with the de facto regime. And this is safety on a very, very basic platform, in a sense that you prevent people from starving to death. basically, and dying from illnesses. So this is critical for the safety of the people of Afghanistan. When it comes to the human rights, of course, Afghanistan is still bound by all the international agreements on human rights and human rights declarations. And as we are not having such a good foothold there anymore, it is critical that UNAMA gets the mandate with a strong human rights component. So the monitoring and reporting becomes even more important so that we can understand what is going on. And of course, we know that many women and other human rights defenders, they have fled from Afghanistan and they have been offered protection in other countries. And here we need to make sure that they have a microphone. And I do think that we listen very carefully to women and others that represent Afghan civil society and that have fled Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any other panel members have a comment here?
I'll just add one thing that mentioned about the humanitarian crisis, I think, and then this whole difficulties as the presence on the ground has been, I mean, there's not much more footprint from the international community. But I think using the international humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan with a very specific gender lens and gender approach would be really, really critical to sort of be neutralized and not very political, but at the same time looking after the woman on the ground. I think that's going to be very, very helpful to many humanitarian organizations in the grassroots run by Afghan women who could benefit from this and then get that support from the international community at this very basic level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akbari.
I would just like to reiterate that we really need to work through the UN, the agencies on the ground, to ensure that the support that the international community is providing actually reaches into providing those education facilities, the basic healthcare facilities, ensuring that the hospitals are able to purchase medical supplies and pay their staff, cover the running costs, pay teachers. All of these things are essential to actually being able to help the people on the ground in Afghanistan. There are many programs, there are many plans. We need them to work. The international community needs to come together with the UN to provide that support on the ground in Afghanistan. Because, as we have all said, without women's meaningful participation and their ability to participate in civic and economic life, nothing will change in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. We're going to wrap up the discussion part and get to the question part. So if people have questions in the audience, please put up your hand and someone will come around with a microphone. Please speak into the microphone, otherwise our online audience won't be able to hear. And we also have a bunch of online questions as well. So I might start off with one of the online questions, and this is from Claire Pearson. And this is directed at Brigadier Garasic, but also I'm sure others will have something to say about this. What are the lessons learned from 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan from the international community, from ISAF? What needs to be done differently?
Thank you for the question. Well, lessons that we have learned in Afghanistan, I have to say some of them are also applicable at home, because also at home we are not still the best of the best, as we could hear yesterday when we were actually commemorating the International Women's Day. So first of all, we have learned that leadership's commitment and accountability really matters. Without that, you cannot gain anything. And since we have been working, I actually have been involved with working with Afghan security forces, I can say at the beginning that everything else what my colleagues have been mentioning, meaningful participation of women in economy, in social life, first precondition is security. So if you don't have security, everything else, it's a little bit harder to gain. Second thing, what we actually learn is that integration of gender perspective, as we all were mentioning today, if you want to start with leadership, it has to be in all strategic documents and followed by some plans and concrete outcomes. And what also have been mentioned today, that especially for me as a military, it was very important to have a good cooperation with civil society. And because they gave me the information, how it is on the ground, what, I mean, not just women or commanders or some high level people I was meeting, what they think, how they feel, what they really need, and how, I mean, this situation of what we have been working on, trying to recruit more women in the military and police. What are the effects really on the ground on this? Of course, the coordination with other international actors, it's very important, and working also with government agencies. For military, it was also very important that all our soldiers, not just some, everybody had the pre-deployment training where they learn that integration of gender perspective is in every area, starting from, I don't know, from logistics to budgeting to intel, because it also helps our, and it was a buzzword, operational effectiveness. So we have learned from both sides, it's really important. And of course, we have learned that we should deploy more women in peace support operations at all levels, that we need to appoint women to decision-making positions, of course, in accordance with their equal opportunity principle, and giving them meaningful roles. And of course, gender perspective, also from military point of view, should be integrated in routine, in daily business, starting from education, planning, reporting, and everything. And I've already mentioned operational effectiveness. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brigadier. Ambassador Skare.
Thank you very much. And I take this opportunity to reflect a little bit on my lessons learned as NATO Special Representative on Women, Peace and Security. And I took office in 2012. And Afghanistan, our experiences from Afghanistan was actually essential for the development of new NATO policies and a better leadership from NATO when it comes to women, peace and security policies. One key lesson that I think many of us have learned, both in international organizations and governments, is that rhetoric is not enough. There's still a huge gap between the policies that are being expressed and what's actually being implemented in the institutions and the organizations. So for me, institutionalization of a policy was extremely important. And I think that's also where we fail, that it doesn't go deep enough. So I align myself with Gordana and about the importance of gender competence, gender advisors in any operations, and not the least a leadership that needs to be kept accountable for taking the priorities of the organization forward. I did see progress, but it was not enough. It was not running deep enough, and we didn't have a structural enough response to the needs of women in Afghanistan. So I think this is key. And I have not been part of the lessons learned exercise in NATO, so I don't exactly know what has been discussed, but I would assume that this is one of the key issues. And then of course we knew already when we were there that there would never be a military solution to the conflict. So I think deep in me, it's really this recognition that we need a strong international presence, and it's only the UN that can do this for us. So this would be my key message of lessons learned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any other comments from the panel on that question?
Yes, please. For me, from a more civilian perspective, I worked in 2012 in Kunduz as a rule of law advisor to the police training mission, and then as an ambassador in Kabul from 2020 on. What I missed was sufficiently integrated thinking. The military leg was dominant, and that was logic, considering also the security situation. But still, an integrated analysis and truly using the instruments that we have as diplomats across the whole spectrum of humanitarian development, security / peace, we could have done this better. The other thing, and this is a lessons learned that's applicable also today, is that we ourselves are not very good in having women on the forefront when it comes to engaging with Afghan counterparts. Even as we speak now, often Western delegations who visit Kabul have no women except the Norwegians. They did a good job, but for the rest, what I've seen, it's men mostly or only men. And another lesson, I think, is just not enough Afghan ownership. We should not forget that we were guests in somebody else's country. And that's what we see now, that after 20 years with this takeover, the feeling sometimes we get is that we have to start from scratch again. And why is that? Did we not engage enough with the Afghan population itself so they could carry on? And also would be aware that they would have options. So the whole reason why the Taliban could take over had to do also, I think, with that we did not realize how deep the war has touched also all humans, women and men in Afghanistan, where they had enough of all war and insecurity, and therefore it was easier for Taliban to take over. So to address this trauma that goes into the DNA, I think, meanwhile, of many Afghans, I think that's the root of it all, and we did not address that at all, I think, as the Western coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Clark or Dr. Akbari?
I think Dr. Akbari would love to have a comment on this one.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I echo what has been said by speakers before me on this topic, but I also agree that mostly I think let's say the failures and then the lessons learned, especially in the WPS agenda, it's not isolated on its own, but related into the bigger package that went wrong in state building system in Afghanistan. Why those agendas, those support did not reach to grassroots level to make a very stronger base that could really fight against the Taliban or the ideology in the country, is the way in which it was executed on the national, on the very elite level. I mean, there has been efforts by different organizations, especially with the UN, and then engage in Afghanistan, the UN Women and the work that they did. A lot of the things, unfortunately, was really much on the surface, and it did not extend very much beyond Kabul. But this also does not mean that it did not affect people or the Afghan people across the country. They heard about it, they listened to it, but it was more like a project based with a deadline and without taking into consideration a lot of the cultural and religious and sensitivity aspects to it. I mean, there was an attention to it, but it just did not really sort of capture the heart and the soul. But I mean, this was also very minor, because I also think that this whole presence, this whole narrative that was being promoted in Afghanistan, it was listened to every household. I mean, I traveled to rural Afghanistan, and I heard how in the last 20 years, including in my own family, how the perception changed about women, about education, about women's equality. The fact that human rights and women's rights become a topic of a household in Afghanistan is an achievement itself. These achievements are not capturable for us statistically to talk about it, but it really did make an impact. A lot more could be achieved and done, which again did not, because of those structural sort of shortcomings and limitation in the whole state building project in Afghanistan, with the woman right being a lot more sort of project based on the urban level rather than like deep rooted in the local level. That's the only comment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Look, just briefly, does anybody in the room have a question? Otherwise, I'll go to another online question. If that's the case, then I would like to introduce a question from a recent evacuee from Kabul, Habib Ahmadzai. The question here is really, what are the consequences of failure? What happens if the Taliban further tightens its rule and its more restrictions on the participation of women and girls in education and in politics and in civic life in general?
It's a tough one.
Ambassador Skade.
I can try. It's really very difficult to answer questions that are in a sense hypothetical, or it's what's going to unfold in the future. I think that if anything, we have learned that the future is very unpredictable, actually. But I would say that I don't know, women's participation is already now extremely restricted. The regime, the authorities are oppressing the women in Afghanistan. So I'm not sure how much worse it could get. So we need to keep the pressure on, of course, to allow for women to access education, justice, basic services, and so on. I think that it's also clear that overall, for any economy that wish to develop, if you do not educate women and girls, if you do not include women in the economic developments, you will lose out simply. Your society will not succeed. You will not achieve the economic growth that you want. You will not achieve the well-being of people. So for me and for I think everybody here, women's participation and women, peace and security policies, they are strategic issues, and we need to recognize them as such. And I do also believe that, maybe that was one of our mistakes, that we didn't recognize it as a true strategic issue, so that it was more of a rhetoric from many present in Kabul. It was very project oriented, right? So, but this is key. If we want to sustain our societies, if we want them to be peaceful and prosperous and equal, then we need to make sure that women are participating. So we as an international community, we do not, of course, run Afghanistan. This is now in the hands of Taliban, and we need to keep the pressure on them to deliver this.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Akbari.
Thank you for that. I would just continue from what Ambassador just said. I think the pressure on is very critical at this very moment, because the Taliban is still in process of forming their administration. We had a caretaker government, and there were certain policies, the continuation from what they have done in the 1990s, continuation of those discriminatory policies. But just to understand that the Taliban came to power militarily, and they are an extremist ideological organization. We would not expect for them to read what is expected from them by the international community. I mean, they lost the chance of recognition, international recognition, just because the way in which they treated women back in the 1990s and again now. But again, as an extremist ideological organization, the Taliban are hostages of its own cohesion. They look into their own internal parties, that how they're going to sell it to their fighters. They used propaganda by demonizing and making this whole project of or state building, democracy, human rights narrative of the last 20 years to recruit fighters. And then once they take over Afghanistan militarily, how would they sell it to their fighters that, yeah, we're going to allow girls to school and accept women as equal? That was for looking at the Taliban internally. I think the way in which they are as an organization, it's in their DNA, it's who they are, that they had to do those things and reinforce those discriminatory policies on women. But now that the Taliban have achieved what it wants, which was a military takeover of Afghanistan, defeat of what they call the post-2001 Afghanistan, and then the international forces there, they use that propaganda. They have achieved that, and then they have sort of passed that fear that they had to lose their cohesion, their fighters. Is now the time that the international community use pressure to help the Taliban and to push them to in a transition from a military ideological organization to a political actor. This is going to take time, but I think now is a time that is going to take form. And I mean, WPS itself was as a result of negotiation, diplomatic engagement. There has been very little diplomatic engagement with the Taliban. I think we should not give up. It should continue, and just to push them in that journey that they have ahead to transition from a military actor to a political actor. By not us giving up on them, because if the way in which they are now, if they come into recognition, they exist, it's just going to be a rotten compromise where the Taliban could exist for many, many years and just continue their policies. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Akbari. Ambassador Weegers.
Thank you. Well, I think that recognition is a long way off of where we are now. And if the Taliban regime would continue and getting even more strict on women's rights, I think this would really go at cost at their internal legitimacy that I talked earlier about, which is so important to sustain as a regime. If you don't have the support of half of the population, at some point, this is going to cost you something. But if you look at the opportunities of this new situation that we are all in, that really forces us to reconsider everything that we have been doing. The opportunities are also is that international NGOs, UN, has come into remote areas where they were not before because of security under previous regimes. So there is more outreach, so that's a good thing. And what we do here is that locally, there are opportunities to negotiate. So I agree totally is that pressure on the leadership of the regime, but also allow for the space locally of the various stakeholders to talk to local Taliban leaders and see what they can achieve. And we hear that it's diverse per province, but there are spaces where things are possible. And I truly hope that also Afghan women take those opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. Do any of the other panel members have any final comments to make?
I think the time to act is now. I mean, they are, to build on Dr. Akbari's, there are comments, they are still a disaggregated organisation. They have yet to form any form of coalition that takes coverage of the entire country. And I think if we can work with regional Afghanistan and regional Afghanis to actually lead in those regions and build their capacity to lead, then we can actually make a difference. And so the time for the international community and through the UN is to actually educate the Taliban about the economic empowerment of women and what it will actually lead to the economic stability of the country. And so we can't step back, we actually have to step in.
Thanks, Ambassador. Brigadier, final comments?
Just to add something to all of the previous speakers said, maybe it will not be too harsh if I say that we should keep this condition-based. This is something I was for when we were there, But of course, sometimes I was not heard enough. But now I can say, I think we should, if we are now, if they are shaping now what they're going to be, we have to continue to keep the pressure and maybe to put some conditions in the game. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Look, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there this evening. I'd just like to thank the panelists for just such a wonderful and interesting discussion based on your such depth of experience in this area. So thank you again so much for taking the time to join us today. I'd also like to thank the Embassies of Norway, Netherlands and Croatia for joining us today and helping us put together this event. And I'd also like to thank the audience for coming today, both online and in the room. Please, if you could give all our participants a great round of applause. Thank you.